Hello, everyone, and welcome to this next episode of the Sustainable Connections podcast. I'm Mark Lee. I'm the Global Director of Thought Leadership at ERM. We are going to examine early outcomes from the latest Conference of the Parties, or COP29, which has been taking place in Baku, Azerbaijan. I should note going into today's conversation that we're actually recording this podcast a couple days before Baku is complete. So you're going to get a mix of reflections from our panelists and also some kind of predictions or projections about how things might come out. We're going to focus on some of the ways that the private sector showed up at COP29 and what the event really means for business in terms of moving forward with climate strategy and implementation. To do all of this, I'm with three colleagues from ERM, and I'm going to have the three of them introduce themselves here in just one moment. All of them were attendees in Baku. They're kind of just in the process of returning home or have just got there. Linden, I'm going to start with you by dint of the fact that you are now farthest away from me, back home in Australia. So if you can tell us who you are, and I'd love to hear a highlight or an anecdote from COP29 as we delve into this conversation as well.
Hi, Mark. Linden Edgell, based in Perth, Australia. An anecdote from Baku. Well, one morning early, I was walking along the waterfront of the Caspian Sea and saw an object on the seafront. Saw some security guards standing there. There was kind of no one else around. But what is this? Got closer and I'm like, that's a beached whale, like a full-on enormous.
Okay.
I don't know. I'm not very good on my whales. Blue whale, like a large whale, right? And I'm like, yeah. Oh my, that's terrible. And it wasn't until I got closer that I'm like, okay, maybe this is art. Maybe this. There wasn't any signage. There wasn't anything. But I guess that was somebody. I think it's an organization called Fins, kind of just reminding the reality of that. But it was just a very kind of odd space with nothing else around it.
Some of the impacts. When you started to talk about the security part, I was worried. I'm glad to hear it was an art installation, but a serious message behind it too. Also in Baku, two of my colleagues sitting in London, James Stacey and Sabine Hoefnagel. James, how about you tell us a bit about your role and something about your experience in Baku as we get started as well?
Yeah, hi everybody. James Stacey. I'm responsible for clients and industries at ERM. A great privilege to have traveled to Baku and attended the conference. In terms of I guess that a lasting memory from the conference was, I think, actually how proud Azerbaijan seemed to be hosting the event and how welcoming everybody was to the visitors. Yeah, it really struck me that this event seemed to matter in terms of how the country represented itself to the outside world.
I think that's interesting in itself. Having been at some of these things, the way they feel on the ground can be different than it's represented in the headlines, and the reflections externally of Azerbaijan as host haven't all reflected just even that sense of welcome. So glad for it. And Sabine, please round this out.
Hi, Mark, and hi, everyone on this podcast. I'm Sabine Hoefnagel. I'm ERM's Global Leader for Sustainability and Risk. So for me, when I was there before, it was 1999. And what I really noticed is like how much Baku has changed in that time, just how much development there has been. When I was there in 1999, I still worked for the United Nations, and I was there supporting the negotiation on the protection of the environment of the Caspian Sea. It was great to be back and really interesting to see how much the country had changed.
Yeah, and that kind of 20-ish years, 22 and a half decades is a flash of time and also forever when you think of what's happened, even in the context of climate. So let's get into that context of climate. I said earlier that we'll focus a lot on private sector perspectives and outcomes, but the COPs do formally belong to governments, and they're the place in the process where nations negotiate how they are going to collectively address climate change and the individual country commitments, right, that need to be made to deliver those collective promises. Baku is the 29th of these. It's been maybe overshadowed in some ways by its predecessor and by the COP that's following. There was a tremendous amount of information and energy out of COP28 in Dubai last year, which was by far the largest COP ever. And there are great expectations for COP30 next year in Brazil. but we want to not miss what happened here, which is very much important in its own right. So Sabine and James, I wonder if you can give us a little bit of a sense of what was anticipated going into Baku, what was the focus? These events usually have a theme. Where did you see that we are in the process of these unfolding year-over-year negotiations? Sabine, will you start?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I have to say, going into Baku, expectations were relatively low. I think that's because at governmental level, it's quite hard to make a lot of progress within a year, but also because there were some really difficult topics on the agenda. The first one being around finance, and particularly about how developed countries are going to support developing countries to be able to deal with the energy transition. Negotiations are obviously still ongoing. They're pretty tough. Expectations are that 2.4 trillion per year is going to be needed by 2030 for developing countries, which is kind of 4 times of where we are now. And the questions really are around, how do we address that shortfall, and particularly who's going to pay? The second difficult topic is on what are called the national determined contributions, NDCs. And those are kind of the plans in which countries set out, how they're going to reduce their carbon emissions. And their expectations are there because the next time that countries need to submit their NDCs is February 2025. So there was a lot of expectation on, our countries actually going to be ratcheting up their plans so we have any chance of staying within reach of the 1.5 degree temperature rise. Now, a few countries did just that. The UK, for example, came out with quite an ambitious plan with commitments of reduction of 81% from 1919 levels by 2035. And Ed Miliband, who is the UK chief negotiator, says that would put the UK on track for achieving a per capita 1.5 aligned scenario, which is science-backed. The UK also is aiming to be the first developed country with a fully decarbonized power system by 2030. A second country that came out already, during this COP was Brazil, who's going to have the presidency next year, and they have committed to cut emissions between 59 and 67% from 2005 levels by 2035. Sorry, lots of numbers there. But Brazil's NDC also includes language around moving away from fossil fuels, which was aligned with a decision that came out of COP last year, COP28. Although they have not provided explicit targets and very detailed measures or timelines. But those were just, some of my observations.
Yeah, no, great headlines and good to have the numbers. The beauty thing about the podcast is people can rewind if they need to catch that detail again. James, I wonder if you had the same sense going in of low or lower expectations than some other times, and what some of your observations were about how that finance and other themes might have been playing out.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely fair that expectations were relatively low compared to some of the previous COPs. We're not yet, I guess, at the end of the negotiations, so we don't quite know where it's going to land at this point in terms of the private finance commitments from high-income countries. So I guess we'll wait and see where that lands. I mean, one of my big takeaways was just being reminded that the world is getting on with this, and that whilst there is a very important political negotiation that plays out through the COP structure every year, technologies continue to come down the cost curve. They continue to be deployed at greater and greater scale, and private industry, the private sector, continues to recognize that this transition is real and that organizations really need to understand what it means to their future and to their strategy, and they need to be integrating the transition into where they're looking to take their organization. And so, almost irrespective of the political discussion, the market is doing its thing and it's moving, and we're seeing really quite significant change in some industrial sectors as a result of agreements made in previous COPs that have enabled the market conditions to be created for organizations to then march on in this space. So I came away feeling that the world is getting on with this. Question whether we're getting on with it quick enough and whether we're going far enough within the time that's allowed, That's a really important question. But the world is getting on with this. And anybody who isn't getting on with it is probably being left behind.
That's all really heartening. I think, again, that reflecting from outside this year, that, well, in a sense, I guess I would say we know we're not getting on with it fast enough yet, but you're saying that there is progress and momentum, and that a wide cross section of actors are leaning into the work. And that's heartening to take away. On that, the headlines I've been watching from here, some of where there seem to maybe be breakthroughs are in some of the hard to abate sectors. And so you were talking about the degree to which industry and the private sector are doing their part. And I wonder what you saw in terms of shipping and steel, any of those other parts of the economy that we know need to transition, and that we've wondered exactly how we would push forward. Progress there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is progress amongst the hard to abate sectors. Obviously, in hard to abate, we're talking about shipping, we're talking about steel, cement, chemicals, petrochemicals, etc. Which do account for a significant amount of industrial emissions. I think it's around 70% of all industry-related emissions. We have seen some breakthroughs. In shipping, there was an industry collective commitment to drive forward emission reductions across that industry. We're seeing first of kind carbon capture and storage and hydrogen projects being deployed within these industries, often in less developed parts of the world. So there's breakthroughs happening there. There's still an awful lot to do in those industries, and they're a long way away from being in a place where we are going to see wholesale emission reduction strategies being deployed across the industry. So I think some positive indicators, but a lot more work to do.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it, but good for those indicators. Sabine, I think you said in another conversation we had earlier this week that there's almost if shipping can do this, then there's no excuse for any sector not to be charging forward. And we need every sector and every geography to confront these issues in their own way, because the challenges can be quite unique. Linden, I'd love to come to you on another topic. And this, again, is sort of one of the things that's been worked at over time. There's something called Article 6 that I'd love you to explain. And it's about carbon markets, nature-based solutions, how we develop them, how we build confidence in them, and how we deploy them. It's been a challenging topic in the COP process and in practice. So love to hear where we're at in terms of Article 6's development and implementation, and just what kind of progress we're making in that carbon market space.
Thanks, Mark. I mean, the carbon markets concept has been around for decades, actually. At its heart, it's about the fact that some people are making reductions in their emissions through reductions or removals, and some people are still emitting because of their economies and so on. And the thought is that if we could set up some sort of trading mechanism where if I've got too much and you've got too little kind of thing, we can trade that, and that finance that is flown can then help further solutions. So that's the concept. Now, this, as I said, started decades ago. In the Paris Agreement in 2015, they had this thing called Article 6, was the way that this was written down to say, okay, let's write down some rules about how countries can trade effectively these emissions. The rules have taken up until now to be agreed, and they're still not quite agreed in the lots of layers of detail that exist. There's concerns about things like double counting, about making sure it's integrity in the actual emissions. So if someone has taken 10 tons or 1,000 tons of carbons, that actually stays there. It's not just a once off. And there's been lots of lawyers and accountants and all sorts of people arguing about this for years. There is optimism that at COP29 we might finally get the rules of the game agreed so that this can actually start to function and real money start to flow through the system. Good news on day one of COP this year that kind of a landmark piece of the whole component was agreed-ish in COP language. That set a really good tone. It's one of the kind of good news stories out of the early days of COP. On the ground in Baku, there was lots and lots of conversations around seeing the carbon markets as a way of unlocking finance for countries that are rich in certain assets, think
rainforests, think about how to improve agricultural production to reduce methane, think of all the sorts of things that countries can do to reduce emissions. And if that can all get agreed, then money can flow to those countries to continue to reduce their emissions and to build the sinks, the carbon sinks that we need to keep drawing down that carbon dioxide. So there's a couple of things at play as to why we need these carbon markets to work. So we have a supply side and we have a demand side. And again, people want to invest money. They want to know that the rules of the game are there. They want to have some certainty around that. And they want to know they're buying something with integrity. And so that's what the focus has really been on. We have what we call the compliance markets. This is regulated by various governments who set up schemes within their countries, generally to help we've heard the term hard-to-abate sectors, so paying those hard-to-abate sectors to reduce or enforcing penalties if they don't reduce their emissions. And then we have the voluntary markets, which is where companies, for example, make commitments, like ERM has itself, to reduce that. And on a voluntary basis, we buy some credits to compensate for the fact that we haven't been able to reduce all of our emissions at this point in time, because we still rely on parts of the system, airlines and shipping and other sorts of things to do that. So good progress. There's still lots of detail to be worked out, but the signals are there. There's a potential to unlock a lot of money. We're talking billions of dollars here to the places that need it to continue to reduce and remove carbon emissions.
There's been justifiable, skepticism and concerns about the confidence we can have in these markets over the years and over times. I perceive a rebound, and I also perceive it as something that we must figure out if we're going to achieve our overall collective goals. So hopeful on that part of the negotiations for progress this year and for progress equally in the voluntary carbon markets. Sabine, I want to flash back to COP28 briefly and kind of get a temperature check on one aspect of what happened last year now. And COP28, the Dubai results stood out maybe most for being the first time that the commitment or a commitment to transition away from fossil fuels was put in writing by the parties. And some of the analysis going into COP29 was checking kind of the state of that commitment and progress against it. I wonder, one, your assessment, and two, how did that sort of play in conversations in Azerbaijan?
Yeah, hard to give a straight answer to that, Mark, because it's still playing out. I mean, as COP29 is happening in Baku, we also have the G20 meeting at the same time in Brazil. And the G20 just came out with a statement, I think yesterday, where they supported the overall consensus that was agreed at COP28, but they failed to call out the specific need to transition away from fossil fuels. So they supported the consensus that includes that statement, but they didn't call it out specifically. Now, the expectations are that that's going to make the negotiations in Baku more difficult. And countries are in different places on this. There are some that are arguing that it should be taken out, but there are also some that are arguing that actually we should now be pushing to set out much more detailed implementation plans around this commitment. So we'll have to see where this goes over the next few days.
Yeah, I looked at and read through those G20 results. And I thought it was a very careful way to support the COP28 statement without putting specific pen to paper or voice behind it in that particular meeting, which in relation to COP30, a bit interestingly, is happening in Brazil. James, I want to come back to you for a different angle on one of the things Sabine talked about at the opening, which the theme this year has been finance and how we finance the transition much through the lens of how developed nations governments support developing nations in facing their climate challenges and dealing with the impacts. But there is a tremendous amount of conversation going on also about the role of private finance in doing this, partly because it's needed, partly to make up the shortfall that we see in what governments are bringing to the table. Can you give us a reflection on that part of what was happening in Baku?
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously, in terms of the transfers of money from a high income to low income through the private finance component, that it relies upon a lot of private sector money flowing. If we look very specifically at the conversation inside the private sector, and the relationship between corporates and their investors and their lenders. Really, the central conversation was around transition plans. Transition plans being the language that's been put to how an organization articulates how its commercial strategy fully integrates the transition to a low carbon economy, and how that strategy delivers a financially successful outcome for that organization, and therefore would be attractive to an investor or a lender to be deploying capital into that entity. Now, that conversation was very rich across the private sector within the COP. And I think there were a couple of things that really came out loud and clear from it. First of all, the transition plan really needs to be substantiated through detailed financial quantification, a detailed return on investment that's presented and articulated in a way that will resonate with an investor that has a fiduciary duty and responsibility in terms of how it conducts its investment into that entity. And then secondly, how important it is that that transition plan is communicated in a way that will be understandable and believable by the investor or the lender. So two really big things, or very important things coming out there. One, detailed financial quantification that substantiates why this is a rational, financially rational journey for that organization to be going on. And then really careful and thoughtful communication that will enable you to take your key stakeholders on that journey with you. And we heard quite a few examples from organizations where they'd got lessons learned and where the quantification maybe hadn't been quite what it needed to be, or the communication had gone wrong. And as a result, an investor or a lender was not fully aligned with the strategic intent that corporate was expressing.
Sabine, I've heard you talking about this recently as well in terms of the elements. James was just running through that almost plan, financial quantification, storytelling triangle, if you will. Did you see some examples of good, best practice climate transition plans coming forward, or can you add to this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first to say, I think transition planning really was one of the most kind of heard buzz phrases on the streets of Baku. And I think that is to some extent because it's becoming a legal requirement in some countries. But as James just explained, it also just makes good business sense. For a company to understand how climate action can provide resilience, create value, or mitigate business risks. And companies are in very different stages with this. Some companies are already onto their next version, so they have done one and they're on version 2, and many haven't even started or are just starting. And because of that, some of the conversations that we had is because it's early days, it's very hard to compare them, and there's also very little consensus on what good looks like. In addition, these plans are going to look very different depending on what sector you operate in, and also depending on what geography you operate in. So, even though investors would love to have something that they can easily compare, that might never become so easy. I also thought what was interesting was some of the conversations around the tension that there is between kind of legal disclosures and telling a story that really provides the reality of where companies are at. In a way, these transition plans are a really great tool to explain, how a company is going to get from A to B and what the dependencies are that they might have to rely on. At the same time, the legal departments, who might see this as a legal disclosure, they will want to be as limited as possible with what they say. And that's not necessarily very helpful in terms of the conversations and the quality of the dialogue that's going on between investors and companies. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out. And then the last thing I mentioned is, maybe we'll come back to this later in the conversation, is should we integrate this with nature transition planning or not? And, for some companies, that makes total sense, especially those that have, that have large amounts of natural assets in the supply chain, or they're reliant on it. Maybe less so for some other industries. So, interesting conversations, and definitely a topic that will see and hear a lot more about.
And Sabine, maybe let's go straight there, because I'm curious about the nature connection. And COP29, of course, was a climate COP, but Baku followed really hard on COP16, the nature COP in Colombia. And one of the things that ERM's been observing over the last few years is the real integration of climate and nature agendas. And you hinted at how that's playing into conversations about transition planning as well. So to what degree was the nature conversation present in Baku, and was there that push for these things to be addressed simultaneously?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, maybe this is because of the sessions that I was in, or the conversations that I picked up, but I felt that the topic of nature, as well as the topic of just transition, were actually not as apparent as I have seen in previous COPs. And I think for nature, maybe that is because we just had COP16 in Cali, in Colombia, and because of these other very difficult topics that we've talked about already that were on the agenda. There's only so much you can address. For just transition, I think what's really hard there is that it means something different for many different stakeholders. If you think about it from a governmental level, it really is about, the kind of transfer of wealth between developed and developing countries, as well as the right for developing countries to develop. If you look at it from a business perspective, it can be around local employment, it can be about impact of communities, it can be about access to energy. And again, it's going to look very, very different depending on what geography you're operating in. Having said all that, in our view, you absolutely need to integrate these pieces. You cannot achieve, the kind of a realistic transition without addressing each of these 3 points. And we had one participant in one of the events that we organized who said, we're not doing climate on Monday, nature on Tuesday, and just transition on Wednesday, which I think sort of sums it up very nicely. And hopes are high that next year in Brazil, that agenda will look different. And what I heard from a number of Brazilians who were there is like they absolutely are looking to lead with those two aspects very much at the forefront, which was less so the case this year.
Yeah, I love that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday breakdown. And I think there is, along with that, the understanding that we must combine these agendas and that we don't yet fully know how. So we're still trying to figure out how to do all of each of those pieces of the work on all of Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and all the other days. But it's one of the reasons I am excited for what might happen next year in Brazil. I think the nature and climate agendas have the greatest potential so far to combine there that we will have seen. A couple more angles I'd love to touch with you, and then we'll bring this to a close. Sabine, one of the things on my mind is the adaptation mitigation debate or dilemma. We would all like for the COP process to have resolved the challenges of climate change already, to have mitigated, stopped, reversed the worst impacts. But that's not where we are. We're talking about how much temperature has risen and how much it is still forecast to rise. And that means that no matter what progress we make from here, adaptation is still going to be required of countries and companies, maybe particularly from the private sector side. What did you hear about adaptation plans in Baku?
Quite a lot, because I would say, like, even if there were no more additional carbon emissions right now, climate change is happening, and also the science doesn't change. So a lot of companies were talking about this and really thinking about how do they address physical climate risk, in terms of their assets, in terms of their supply chains, etc. And companies really planning for that, because it's just a pure kind of business resilience issue. If you're looking at the events that have and are happening very recently, like from Spain, Brazil, Pakistan, many places in the world, and global businesses will have operations and supply chains in all those places. So yes, absolutely a topic. What I thought was interesting is I talked to one person from a company who said it's not just about their own assets and their own operations. It's also about what does physical climate risk mean for the communities around their operations. Because in many countries, there might be really extreme climate change impacts, and governance might not necessarily be ready and able to address that. And the expectations really are there for companies to step in. So what are the responsibilities from business vis-a-vis governments, and how is that, again, it's like it's sort of part of the just transition conversation. How is that going to be addressed? So yes, lots of discussion around it, and very high on the agenda for most businesses who I spoke to.
Yeah, and for all those major events that you were ticking through, some of them, Spain particularly standing out in my mind, perhaps in these last few months, and the human cost there. I think for any company that isn't sure whether they have a moral or an ethical reason to address climate change, the adaptation agenda just points to the need to think about physical supply chain risk, facilities, their own employees, everything else, and provides a compelling reason to do this work. Linden, I wanted to come to you on renewables, and this is another topic that was really a big focus at COP28 in Dubai. We had major commitments announced then about the ambition for renewables growth and increases in efficiency by 2030. We must do these things if we're going to deliver on Paris ambitions. Where are we at in terms of progress?
Yes, so ERM is a member of the Global Renewables Alliance, and we are, with them very focused on this tripling renewables and doubling energy efficiency by 2030. So we need to move away from fossil fuels, and we need to meet the increasing demand for energy around the world, which is growing exponentially, actually. Plus, we have a vast number of the world's population who still don't have access to energy, safe, reliable, affordable energy today. So we started the COP session. We heard that in terms of solar, there is now 2 terawatts of solar installed around the world. That's a massive number. It took, I think, 65 years to do the first terawatt and about 10 years to do the second terawatt, something of that order of magnitude. So it gives you a sense of the scale and the reduction in the costs of solar. And we know that in many parts of the world, renewables are the cheapest form of energy. So we are hearing terms like cost of living and inflationary factors in many economies around the world. It is the cheapest form. And so it's kind of becoming a no-brainer for many economies to jump on this. In the last year, there was about 430 gigawatts, another big number, of renewables installed around the world. That's a lot, but it's not enough. And so the real push was around how do we accelerate both the generation of power and then getting that power to where it needs to be. So this speaks to transmission lines, it speaks to the grids, it speaks to smart technology, AI systems and so on, to move the energy source to where it needs to be at the right moment of the day and time and meet industry needs and household needs and everything else. And it also speaks to storage, because sometimes the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow where it needs to. And so the grid needs to be able to accommodate for that. So again, we were featuring on a panel around the storage and grids question. Another big topic that came with it, and we've actually published a piece on this, is around both the environmental and the social dimensions of renewables. And that's where a lot of the tensions are arising in communities. As more of these facilities are being built, solar, wind farms, etc., or even offshore wind and some of the other sort of systems that go with that, communities are feeling the pressure. And I think we need to make sure that those communities are in the conversations, that environmental integrity is there in and around these developments, while at the same time we accelerate that. Good news out of the G20 in the last day or so, there was an affirmation about the tripling renewables pledge. So that's good to see coming from the G20. And then today it was announced that there is a global clean power alliance being formed. So this is the UK, Australia, France, Germany, the African Union, talking about mobilizing the finance. And the finance is really, again, as we've been talking about, a really critical factor. So good to see that those signals are coming from the G20. Good to see that countries, companies, and economies are seeing that renewables are absolutely the way to go. And we need to work together right across the system to deploy it at speed and scale.
Amazing. Actually, there's lots there that's positive. It also underscores the complexity of getting these big goals delivered. It ties back again to our notion with sustainable connections that this requires all kinds of collaboration to get done. In this case, to deliver the finance, to build the infrastructure, to connect people to the new clean energy being developed. I think on that note, we'll make our final pivot and let's just give each of you a quick chance to speak to any hopes you have for the end of the negotiations, and even maybe for COP30 in Brazil. So chance to look into the future, just the next few days, how might Baku wrap up, and or to look into next year. And Sabine, why don't I have you go first, and Linden will close out with you.
That governments will continue and even more recognize the huge opportunities that are part of this transition that we're going through. This is not just a story of doom and gloom. There is an enormous amount of opportunity that will create economic growth, will improve people's lives, and will actually keep human life possible on this planet. So I hope that recognition will be there, and that will shine through in the negotiations. And then, very practical, like we really do get an agreement on Article 6 that Linden has been talking about, because that would be a major outcome.
And Linden, your view?
Show me the money, as the phrase goes. We absolutely need to see serious intent about the money. And there's kind of all sorts of political kind of negotiations going on. The amount of money pledged has to be serious enough that it is signaling that people recognize climate change is here now, right now. Impacts are now, not promises into 2050. And so that cash needs to flow. It needs to flow in a way that isn't increasing debt for many of the developing parts of the world, which is currently what is happening. Public money needs to take out the risk. Private money needs to follow. So we absolutely need to see that, and done in good faith. I think there's all sorts of agendas at play. That's kind of international negotiations, but like there has to be good faith at play. And then I think we really need to very soon after that see ambition in these country plans. We need to see plans that make sense, that join the dots between what's happening in climate impacts today around the place, that the financial flows that will go with that, what it means for real lives, and all of these dots need to be joined that make sense for that country. And looking to Brazil, I think, as we've talked about, I think Brazil will really trying to bring us to a point where it says, okay, there's some money, the ambition is there, how do we join the climate agenda, the nature agenda, and what it means for people together, and really get after this. 2024 is going to be the hottest year on record. Mm-hmm. There has been more than $100 billion of insurance payouts for natural disasters this year. That is not going to change. The science is not going to change. And so we absolutely need the action at pace, at scale. There's a lot of noise in the system, but we have to just keep going forward.
Yeah, agree heartily with both of your kind of closing statements and the hopes that are embedded in them. This is a must-do task for us, for all of us, and we do need to see it all executed in good faith. We've had lots of years of ambition set, promises made, and we are hopefully moving farther and farther into the delivery mode against those, but there's more and more to do. I'll just close out by saying thanks not only to the three of you, Sabine and Linden and James, but also to everybody who's taken the time to listen to us. If you are interested in more of the Sustainable Connections podcast, they can all be found on erm.com. We would be interested in any of your feedback anytime. And we hope for your sake as well as ours that all of Baku's ambitions are realized and that they do nothing but build on the way to Brazil. Thanks and bye for now.